you've heard about IEEE quite a lot at this conference. Just very quickly, we are about collaboration. So it's all about setting standards, convening in conferences, and publishing with academia, governments, and so on. With one big tagline is advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. And yeah, we have 60,000 people in Europe, 400,000 worldwide.
Okay, so you can now tell us more about the kind of how you take inclusion and ethics into account when bringing standards.
Thank you. So thank you, and well, welcome again. Let me see how this clicker works. Yeah, I'm sorry. So here is actually what I already said about IEEE. In addition to the 60,000 members in Europe, we have more than 400,000 members worldwide. And maybe one of the things I did not mention, we are also a standard-setting organization. So probably a lot of you here use our most popular standard. It's the Wi-Fi standard. What I'm also very proud of is that we are also focusing on social impact. So we are also working with governments and continuous education. And we're also interested in ethics and technology, and basically that's what we are going to talk about today. So before going to AI, I would like to go back in time a little bit and to impact on a technology which has an equally important importance for our life and society, and that is the car. So this is on the left side, you see a picture taken in San Francisco, the Market Street, 1906. I can remember well because that's the birth year of my grandmother as well. And you can see there are a lot of cars, by the way, electric cars. At that time, it was still not decided what kind of cars it's going to be. So a lot of electric cars, early day cars, carriages, cable cars, pedestrians, who basically walk in all directions. So pretty chaotic situation. And if you think it's chaotic, I can tell you it was really, at that time, especially between the two world wars, it became a metaphor. So I don't know how many of you have read The Great Gatsby from Fitzgerald or seen the movie. You know how it ended? In a car crash. And that's the way also how many private destinies ended. So something had to be done. And so I just want you to reflect a little bit everything that had to be put in place in order to come to a situation that we have today. It's not a perfect situation, but it's still managed situation in comparison to the number of the cars and the number of persons who are now on the street. So what did we have to do first? Well, first of all, we had to agree on a principle. And we agreed that safety is important. And that's not so trivial, because we had to give up another principle, that of speed. If you think now on AI, just think about it. It's also freedom of movement. If you think here, you had all movements in every direction. So once we agreed on the principles, we had to put in place a lot of other things. We had to agree on which side of the street we should go, right or left. By the way, we did not agree on that in the whole world. Then we had to put other things in place, like stoplights. We had to educate our children not to walk on the street. We had to have driver's lessons, and so on. So now coming back to our situation and AI. So we heard about it, a lot of potential application scenarios. And by the way, I would say, as concerns these social norms, we are, to be provocative, on the Market Street in San Francisco, 1906. Because it's true that we have all this potential, but as concerns governance, we still don't have many norms in place. And for instance, one of the most important things is I don't know how many verification or validation mechanisms we have. And let's just look why this could be important in an AI system. So maybe some of you know this already, but for those of you who don't, maybe you just take a few seconds and see why this poor dog on the right side was classified as being a wolf. Do you know why? Because of the snow, exactly. So the AI system learned that wolves are in a snowy environment and dogs not. So once he saw the spore dog as associated with snow, it classified it into being a wolf, which might be interesting. But it, of course, poses a lot of questions. One was we discussed about accuracy. So this system can be perfectly accurate if it's tested in this environment. As long as wolves are have snow around them, and dogs don't have, it will provide a perfect accuracy. So that means, also coming back to what you said, how important it is to train and test the systems in different application scenarios. And since we heard so much about inclusion, I would like to bring another example. So our headquarters in Europe is in Vienna, and this is very much in the press right now. Maybe you've heard about it as well. It's the case IMS. It's the Austrian Public Employment Agency. So it's so much in the press because they decided to put in place a software, an automated decision system, which predicts the employability of people. And it does so by taking into account age, education, obviously, number of children, how often you've taken off to take care of the children, and so on. And there are voices in the press who said, okay, so of course these clusters, we also determine the support that these people get in order to have a job later on. And of course people say that let's say the groups who traditionally had a lower employability will remain there because they will always be put in that cluster. And there's no way to get out of it. And for instance, women with children, or even men who don't have high education, or who happen to have their house in a neighborhood which traditionally doesn't have a high employability. Of course, the IMS also counters and says, well, this is actually not true. We are going to focus on those groups as well. But what I think is even more important is that they argue with the argument of efficiency. They say we have more and more cases, we have less and less people to deal with these cases. There are public servants who are going to retire, so we need the systems in order to have a decision support for these decisions. And I want to make a case on this because this efficiency and speed, of course, has a basis. I'm going to borrow a slide from IBM, who basically say the amount of data is going to increase exponentially. So in addition to the personal data that we are dealing with here, we also have all the non-personal data and semi-personal data, so things that are captured by sensors, IoT devices, and so on. So we have the data which has this exponential growth, and our capacity to adapt or make sense of it is just limited. It's growing linearly. So the argument here is that we need technology to bridge the gap. And the question is, of course, now coming back to the example that I have from Vienna, shows that, of course, you can put this system in place and it can be accurate, but it is in a social environment. So what we need is basically a discussion on agreement on new norms, on how to deploy these systems, if we should deploy them, and how to make them, under what conditions that would be acceptable. I think that what you do at Microsoft is really remarkable because it's not very often the case. So when we take AI into account, we have an additional problem, AI or neural networks. Very often we don't even know what's inside. So this is a picture of a dish I got in France, which looks very nice, but at first sight you say, well, what is inside? And the idea that we try to promote is that we need this information. We heard it in the previous session as well. You need information because you need informed trust. If you don't have information, you basically have two choices. One is not to trust the system, which I think is not an option because we just heard about the data increase and so on. And of course also the potential, for instance, in very controlled environments, AI is very good in accuracy to detect skin cancer. But if the other option would be to have blind trust in the technology, which I think in this environment I don't have explained is not an option either. So what we say is it's important to make this implicit explicit. So even coming back to Microsoft, I think it's very nice what you do, but how many people know? And there should be a way to make this information available in a standardized way so that people can actually relate to that. And it's going to be even more important because we are moving away from these AI systems which are contained in one organization, but we are moving to an environment where we have a supply chain of AI solutions. So it's important to have that information. So we need to agree on community norms. We start with principles and also the definition of principles. We heard transparency, for instance, can mean different things. Then one thing which I think is totally missing very often in the current discussion is how to achieve that, how to get to that principle. So it's like saying, I would like to have a very, very good dish which tastes very good, but I don't give the recipe to that. So it's important to also have guidelines or standards on how to achieve that. And then the third is how to measure, or how to prove, so how to also communicate that. And I'm not only discussing about explainability in the sense the AI system has to explain why it took a decision. Very often we have missing information on accuracy. On design, why was it designed for at the beginning? Because you can take one trained solution and use it in another environment. Sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not working at all. Have there been any risk assessment put in place? IP rights, curation, validation of data, and so on. So just some examples. So what did we do in IEEE? And I have here John Havens, the Executive Director of Ethically Aligned Design. We built a community already 3-4 years ago. We started with that, basically with technologists and us, the technical community, but very early on incorporating also other voices, from policymakers to politicians, ethicists, and so on. Because we saw that there is a special thing coming with what we call autonomous intelligence system. We don't say AI, because we don't like the term of artificial intelligence. And one of the outcomes of this ethically aligned design was to recognize what are some issues around autonomous systems and to provide some recommendations. And yes, we also have principles, just like many other principles which are out there. By the way, I think that it's very important that people have these principles and different communities have set out these principles because it starts, you first start to reflect on this the first time. However, I think that many of these principles are in 3 clusters. The first cluster is around an individual, which we call, for instance, universal human values, which would be an anthropological view, privacy, dignity, and so on. Then it's about our relationship amongst each other, which would be the second category, which would include inclusiveness, but also democracy. And then the third would be on technical dependability. So actually make sure that the system is performing according to what you would like to do, and it includes things like security, safety, and so on. So once you have these principles, the second step would be the guidelines on how to achieve it. So we're a standard-setting organization. We started, I think, almost immediately, more or less, in parallel to work on our standards. And I see some of our volunteers here who participated in that. I just highlighted some because I think it's really important. The first one is really on how to make sure to take the values into account already in the design process. So it's very much what you said in a standardized way. How do you engage with your stakeholders, so the potential users, and see what their values is, what kind of risk there are, and how you mitigate these risks, and also how you document this whole process. Then there is also transparency, algorithmic bias, but you see also some new aspects like facial recognition and effective computing. And here again, one more example on transparency, just to make the case. Transparency can be, for instance, completely different in different industries. For instance, in AI and law that we are also working on right now, you really need to have an explainability of why a decision was made, obviously. You probably would not like to have the same happen for your automatic driving assistant. You don't want to explain him, this is why I took the decision to turn right or left. But even in the same industry, you would have different levels of transparency. For instance, my elderly mother who would like to know why the care robot suggested that she should take her medicine right now. She would like to understand that. It would be a different level of transparency to someone who's coming repairing that. So the standard is basically defining different levels of transparency so that when you have the interaction with the stakeholder being users or other stakeholders, suppliers in the supply chain, you actually know what the other party is doing. So how do we now know that somebody who said that follow the standard actually did it? And here is something that we started last year at the MyData conference, so it's the 1-year anniversary. Mary, you just heard her in the last session. So she's the chair of our certification program, and we started the certification on accountability, transparency, and algorithmic bias. We're going to finish this, by the way, until the end of the year. So just one argument that we hear very often is namely how can you set a standard on ethics, because ethics is so different in different geographies and even within the same geographies. And I would just like to come back to our technical standards, the Wi-Fi, which works everywhere similar. If you go to Shanghai or here in Helsinki, you have the same standard. It's working the same. You have other standards which are not like that. You've seen it on the right. However, if there are standards, that means that you have information. And once you have information, you know how to mitigate. You have a solution how to switch from one standard to another. So here again, I think it's important to have this component of informed trust. And basically, that would be also my last slide. So in order to, I think the motto of this conference is also how to regain trust. And in order to gain trust in the society, I think we have to agree on new norms, starting from principles, then a common understanding on how to achieve these principles. We also need to build up competence, like driving lessons and driver's licenses, maybe. And then we also have need some evidence and proofs that this is actually happening. And last but not least, I think that we need regulation, because we need some stoplights. We need to have some speed limits. We need to know what is acceptable and what not in the society. And I'm really looking forward to what the Commission is going to propose in 100 days. Thank you.